thoughts about any of that, the local press and press regulation up next. It's hashtag R4Media Show if you use Twitter. And, of course, you can always email us via the website. Now, arguments about press regulation. Everyone has agreed that something must be done, although precisely what remains hotly disputed, have not really focused on Britain's struggling local and regional press. Until last week, that is, when the government announced a change to their cross-party press regulation royal charter, specifically to allay concerns expressed by local newspaper groups about the potential cost to them of the low-cost arbitration service Lord Justice Leveson said any new self-regulator must have. Already struggling financially, local publishers claimed any additional burden arising from arbitration settlements that might previously have been sorted out informally at no financial cost could prove ruinous. So the government changed their charter to allow, after a review, local papers to opt out of that part of any new regulatory scheme. So, has that done the trick? Are local papers now supporting the cross-party charter, so vigorously rejected by most of the national press? I'm joined by Sir Ray Tindle, who runs Tindle Newspaper Group, comprising some 200 local titles. Sir Ray is unusual in a number of respects. He is 87, lost his voice box to cancer 14 years ago, and get this, his newspapers actually make money. Sir Ray, many thanks for joining us. Before we get on to press regulation, just tell me, how do you make money when so many others in your field of local press simply don't seem able to?
Well, it's magic, but I'll try to tell you. We run the papers individually. They really run themselves. In fact, we have only a very small head office, just three others and myself. Each paper has its own manager or managing director and editor, and they know their area. They live and work in their area. And we've had a few papers which have gone into a loss, and mostly they're back out again now, but it's primarily because the staff are local people and they've worked very hard. I've got a great staff and I'm glad to pay tribute to them in this way.
It's often said, of course, though, that the fundamental underpinning of the local newspaper business model, in the words classified advertising, that the internet has just sort of killed that. If it's killed so many others, why has it not killed you?
I think you're possibly thinking of the bigger ones. But my papers are local weeklies, and we have lost some advertising, of course. But we've partly been able to make it up with run a paper, displayed ads. But we still have enough to make a profit, and we're still surviving quite happily, thank you.
And do you envisage that state of affairs continuing, or do you see problems coming as the digital age advances?
I envisage it in completely as it is now. It will continue. We shall be alive for another 100 or 200 years. I've got 70 papers that are over 100 and one over 200. And I wouldn't mind betting if we could come back in another 100 years, they'll all still be here.
OK, thank you very much for that. Moving on to the question of press regulation, where do you see the local press standing in all of this? Because, as I say, I think it's widely accepted that you weren't really the problem. Not to say there aren't some problems, but you weren't really the problem. Where's your estimation of where you stand in this now?
Well, we haven't yet seen the wording of the so-called opt-out clauses, but we understand that they refer to arbitration fees and are at the discretion of the regulator. So welcome as they may be when we learn about them, they are not an opt-out from the major scheme now being proposed. Now, as you said in your introduction, I'm a local weekly newspaper man, and have been ever since I left the army at the end of World War II. I can only speak for myself, though other local newspaper men may agree. There are 1,000 local papers in the UK, and although my papers don't carry national news, I should say categorically and as strongly as I can that I'm convinced we must maintain the right to free speech and the right to have a free press. Free speech is non-negotiable.
So what is it in the proposals that are being discussed, the cross-party charter, that you think threatens free speech? Because there'd be people on the other side of this argument who would say, well, there's nothing there to threaten free speech, quite the reverse.
Well, we are, at this moment, free to say what we like, dependent on the libel laws, of course, and the other laws of the country. But when this charter goes through, it is, of course, a charter written by politicians, imposed by politicians, and controlled by politicians, and it was devised at a meeting in which the press was not present. And in our view, it means the end of the freedom of the press that we've had for so long.
Why so? I mean, you could equally argue that it was constructed along the lines that Lord Justice Leveson suggested, he had a huge and very expensive inquiry into it all, where we heard all manner of horrors about what, as I say, not mainly the local press, but other elements of the press had done. And it could be argued that all it's doing is bringing into effect what Leveson said should happen.
Yes, but you said not mainly the local press. In fact, what Leveson said was that the local press was not involved at all. He said that he hoped the government, would not impose any burden on the local press who were not at fault. Well, we're proud of that, of course, but we're standing by our national friends and our daily newspapers in the provinces who do feel very strongly that this will not enable them to produce the sort of papers they have been, which have done many good things. I know, of course, that there have been problems, especially with hacking, and nobody is defending that. Indeed, the press has itself come forward with suggestions for improving the oversight, as it were, of that problem.
Just two things, if I may. First of all, and the concession on the arbitration scheme, that doesn't give you confidence that it would be fine for you to join this. You're still not happy about it.
I am not happy about it, and having the possibility of an opt-out from arbitration fees, if the regulator so decides, doesn't do anything for us at all.
OK. But will you be joining IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organisation that some of your colleagues in the national press are putting together?
Oh, I think so. We've not given it a great deal of thought until this came up. But yes, the press, I think, will all stand by that sort of thing. OK. So Ray Tindle, many thanks. And do stay with us if you can. So where do the public stand on arguments about press regulation? The Media Standards Trust published some figures earlier this week suggesting that 71% of us supported the cross-party charter plan that most of the press rejects. Then this morning, the Sun newspaper carried more research from the same company, YouGov, suggesting that 76% of us fear any system involving politicians at all will be used by them to avoid scrutiny, and that only 47% of us want any form of tighter press regulation at all. Well, Martin Moore is from the Media Standards Trust, who support the cross-party charter, and joins me now. Martin, thank you very much indeed.
Good afternoon.
Before we get into the detail here, do you have any sympathy with Sir Ray's position?
I have an awful lot of sympathy for the local press, particularly given the financial situation. But if you look at the public attitudes, particularly the opinion polls, right the way through the last 2 years, there have been 21 polls over the last 18 months, the public are absolutely consistent in their view that there needs to be regulation, and there needs to be tougher regulation than there was previously.
Well, you say that, although the Sun produced a figure here, which I quoted, where I think it's only it's only 47% think that there need to be tighter regulations at all. I mean, again, you can argue about the nature of the questions that are asked, but that doesn't sound like a screaming majority to me.
Well, first of all, I mean, if you look at, I think, 6 polls, they range between about 47% and 70%. And the comparison is those who think there should be less tough regulation, or they're about right, is far, far lower. I think less tough is below 10%, and that they're about right is about 30%. So generally the public believe there should be a system of regulation. They believe, funnily enough, actually, the polls aren't mutually exclusive. It might surprise you for me to say that, but the public have been remarkably consistent over the last 18 months in the sense that they want tougher regulation, they want it to be independent and effective. They're happy for the press to set it up and to fund it as long as there is some independent system of checking it and making sure it's working on behalf of the public.
So the questions that you asked were about whether people wanted independent checking on the new self-regulator, and you came up with that 71% said that they wanted a periodic review of the self-regulator, which is probably uncontroversial even amongst large parts of the press. The question is whether the mechanism suggested in the cross-party charter, given that it can only be changed by a 2/3 vote in both houses of Parliament, whether that counts as independent. I mean, if you'd explained that in the question, do you think you'd have got the same result?
Well, funnily enough, actually, The Guardian commissioned ICM to run a poll over the weekend, and it asked a question on a very similar issue, but it asked it quite differently. It said, it asked it in terms of, would you put yourself forward for recognition by a state body? So it actually referred explicitly to the state. And they came out with a figure of 64%, so 64 to 71.
So lower.
Well, 7% lower, as opposed to less than, I think it was 20% who said the other way. So we're talking about a very similar figure of about 2/3 of the public believe that it should go through this process.
I suppose the question would be that it's because of the use of everyone. If you say, do you want mother and apple pie? Do you want independent regulation of the press? Yes, we do. Do you want independent assessment of a self-regulator? Of course we do. I come back to the question though: what counts as independent? And the press's argument essentially is that a charter that can only be changed by politicians is an open invitation at some level for politicians to interfere. And indeed, one thing that the Sun poll did show, and I don't know again if you would agree with this, is that they found 79% of people asked felt there was a real risk, that 76% said, there was a real risk that any system involving politicians would at some point be used by them to avoid scrutiny.
Which is exactly why the Royal Charter explicitly excludes politicians in quite a number of places from the regulator itself, from the board, from the staff, even from the Appointments Committee, and that it, within law, within the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act, it has protection for the Charter from interference by politicians, unlike the Charter put forward by the press.
Well, except that 2/3 of them can change it, and if by my reading of it, any change that's suggested has to go once it's passed that hurdle is through.
What I find bizarre is that it's easier to pass a law establishing a statutory body for which you only need a simple majority than it is to change the Charter. You only need a majority of MPs to pass a law or to dissolve the Charter, whereas you need 2/3 of both houses to change the Charter. So actually there's a higher hurdle to change the Charter for politicians than there is to pass a new law.
All right, Martin Moore, many thanks indeed. And thanks again to Sir Ray Tindle. That's all we have time for this week, I'm afraid. As ever, do feel free to get in touch through our website where you can email us or download a copy of the programme. If you use Twitter, you can join the conversation, as they say, about any of the topics in today's programme using the hashtag R4Media Show. So thanks for listening, and do join us again next week. Same time, same place.
Thank you for downloading the Media Show podcast from BBC Radio 4. The presenter was Steve Hewlett. For more information, please go to our website, bbc.co.uk/radio4/Media Show.